So the form element itself is not necessarily all that important for front-end developers who are primarily communicating with the server via JavaScript and AJAX. But the form input elements, text fields, drop-down menus, and the like, are extremely important. So with standard form submissions, if you're not doing AJAX, you're not doing JavaScript, you're just submitting a form, talking to the server, getting a result page back, then it's required by the rules of HTML that the input elements go inside a form, because otherwise the server wouldn't know which query parameters go with which submission. And the elements must have a name attribute. The name attribute we saw in the previous section becomes part of the query parameters. And if you recall from the previous section, with a GET request, the query parameters get attached to the end of the URL. With a POST request, the query parameters get sent as a separate part of the network request. But either way, the elements have to have a name, and the name becomes the query parameter name in the submitted form. If you're primarily doing JavaScript, probably with jQuery, and you're doing AJAX, that's the way JavaScript talks to the server, then there's no requirement that the elements go inside a form. However, we will see that some of the jQuery functions make it a little bit simpler if you do wrap the elements inside form just for organization. jQuery will build a query parameter string for you. But typically, you use ID. Remember that ID uniquely identifies an HTML element, and that makes it easier for the JavaScript jQuery, which is a JavaScript library, to find your element because there's only one element in the page that has that particular ID. So with standard form submissions, you always have a name. With JavaScript AJAX requests, you usually have an ID. Now, sometimes you use the name as well. It depends on the JavaScript or jQuery function that you're using. We will use one that makes use of the name, but ID is used widely for JavaScript requests to the server, whereas name is always used for standard form submissions. All right, so let's look at the kinds of elements that can go inside a form, which might not necessarily be wrapped in the HTML form tag. The most simple and most widely used one is a text field. And you can say input type equals text, but the HTML specification says, and browsers enforce in practice, that that's the default type. So it's also just common to leave off the type attribute altogether and just say input. However, remember that even though we're using HTML5, which doesn't technically require end tags, we are acting as though we're following the rules of XML, and so open tags need close tags. It's very rare that an input element would have body content, something that appears between the start tag and the end tag. So to be legal, you then need to have the slash right inside. It's easy to overlook that in my examples, so please remember that these are self-closing tags. They have the end slash right at the end. Value, if you say input type equals text or just input, and you say value equals Jane, then Jane will appear in the text field initially, and that's a real value. If the user doesn't change that and they send the form either by a regular form submission or AJAX, Jane gets sent as the initial value. So that's the purpose of the value attribute. It's the real default value. But there's also an attribute called placeholder. Placeholder shows temporary text. The text kind of appears in the text field, but as soon as the end user clicks in the text field, it disappears. So it never becomes part of the submission, whether you use a regular form submission or JavaScript. It's just kind of a hint. So for example, you might have a prompt in front of the text field that says phone number. But what format do you put the phone number? Do you put parentheses? Do you put dashes? Do you put spaces? That information might be in the placeholder text. You might have an example phone number, parentheses 415 parentheses space 123 dash 4567, and that'll give the end user a hint of the format of how to enter the information. So sometimes it's not necessary to have a placeholder, but the point is that placeholder and value are different. Value is a real initial value that, if not changed, becomes part of the submission. Placeholder is temporary text that gives the user a hint, if necessary, and disappears as soon as the end user clicks in the text field. All right, so it might look like this. Now, CSS, which we'll cover in the next section, can style text fields. So it's very common to make text fields bigger, to make the background color of the text field when you click on them be something other than white, to make the corners rounded, to make the text inside be a different color, and so forth. But the default text field is typically square corners, white background, black text. Regular text fields are the most common type of input element, but there are also password fields. You say input type equals password, and it looks like a normal password field, except that when the user types into it, the text is obscured and asterisks are displayed. Well, why use a password field? Answer, obviously it has something to do with security, but whenever you say it has something to do with security, you need to say security from whom? Who's the potential attacker that a password field is protecting against? Well, it doesn't provide any extra security from some sort of hacker who's listening on the network connection. You need SSL for that. It provides extra security from the person who's sitting behind the end user, peeking over their shoulder as they enter their password or their credit card number. So on a normal form submission, if you use get, the information appears in the URL. And so on a normal form submission, if you use a password field, you also have to use post, because there's no point in obscuring the password as the person enters it if the real password appears on the URL line as soon as they press submit. However, with JavaScript, the information is not displayed to the end user or the person peeking over the end user's shoulder either way. So the requirement that post always goes with password fields is for normal form submissions. For JavaScript requests, the user doesn't see the information unless you display it to them either way. Okay, you've got regular text fields, you've got password fields, and then you've got text areas. A password field is one line. A text area is multiple lines. With or without scroll bars, you can turn them on or off. But there's one extra interesting feature of text areas, is that if inside the text area in your actual file as a default value, or when the end user types it in, you have regular HTML tags, those HTML tags are not interpreted by the browser as regular HTML unless the end text area tag appears in there. So the text areas, in addition to gathering input from users, is used to display HTML text as long as the HTML text that you're displaying to the end user doesn't contain the end text area tag. So it might look something like that. There are also lots of different ways you can make buttons that users can click on. And in normal form submissions, the most common button is a submit button. Input type equals submit. And it creates something that looks like a button. And usually you give a value, that's the label of the button. But if you don't give a value, then most browsers give a default that's something like submit query. In a normal form submission, if you have more than one button, it's important to give the button's name so you can tell them apart. We'll see that in the next slide. But if you're using JavaScript, this is not so important. In fact, in JavaScript, it's much more important to just say, it's much more common to just say input type equals button. Because it doesn't matter how you designate the button, because you are attaching your own code to it. You aren't using the default browser behavior. So you say input type equals button, and you say one of two things. One thing that you can say is on click, and then you list a JavaScript function call. When the end user presses the push button, it calls as JavaScript code. But it's also quite common to say input type equals button, and then just give the button an ID, and don't say anything about what happens when you click on it. And we'll see later that we will run JavaScript code that when the page is loaded, will attach the JavaScript on-click handler from the JavaScript code. You never actually list it in the HTML code. Both approaches are widely used with JavaScript and AJAX. And so with JavaScript and AJAX, input type equals button with or without an on-click attribute is much more widely used than input type equals submit. You can also have reset buttons. They look the same as normal buttons, but when you press them, if they're inside a form tag, then anything the user has entered into the other text fields is cleared and it reverts to the default. And then something that's quite useful with or without JavaScript, this is useful in both situations, is the button element. The thing about the button element is you can put normal HTML between the start and the end tags. And then what happens is the browser kind of wraps a 3D looking border around it. But you can have regular buttons that look like this. You can have buttons that look like they're more than one line. How do you do that? You just make some HTML that has a BR tag in it for line break. You can have font changes. Just use normal font elements in the HTML that's between the start and end tag of button. You can put images. You can put images plus font changes. You can put more than one image and so on. You can wrap a group of HTML inside the button tag. The browser will wrap a border around it that looks kind of rounded in 3D, but you can control then what's inside. So the input type equals button and the button element are the two that are most widely used with JavaScript, and we will in particular concentrate on input type equals button because it's the simplest. All right, in normal form submissions, not when you are contacting the server by AJAX, people worry about what happens if you have more than one button in the page. Well, if you have more than one button in the same form of the page, then how does the server tell which button you pressed? Why do you have more than one button? They presumably have more than one action. So with JavaScript, this is no problem. You just attach a different on-click handler to the two buttons. But if you're doing a normal form submission, then you need to give names to the buttons only if you have more than one button in the same form. So you might have one called add and one called delete. And the reason for doing that is that if you have those two buttons in the same form element, the add query parameter or the delete query parameter, the names that are provided, will be part of the data that gets sent to the server, and so the server can distinguish between the two buttons. But again, if you are sending data via JavaScript, no problem, because you attach a different JavaScript function to each of the buttons. All right, checkboxes. You just say input type equals checkbox. And initially, when HTML first came out, there was an attribute called checked. If you omitted this attribute, the checkbox was initially unchecked. If you provided this attribute, it was initially checked. The problem is an attribute with no corresponding value is illegal in XML. Now, HTML5, which is what you're probably using and what I normally use, allows this. But it's probably not a good idea. It's a good strategy to follow the general rules of XML because that's how the browser represents things internally, and it's just easy to visualize. So you have to do what's a little bit goofy, looks a little bit goofy, which is you would say checked equals, and you provide some value like checked or like true, just so that it's not an empty attribute. And in normal form submissions, if the checkbox is not checked and you submit the form, nothing having to do with that checkbox is sent at all. Nothing is sent. It doesn't send the name of the checkbox equals false. It just doesn't send anything at all. Although with JavaScript, you can, in your code, go read the value of the checkbox and decide what to send. You could send true or false, or you could send two different parameters, or you could just, not send anything if it's false. So this is a problem or a complexity in normal form submissions that's not so important in JavaScript when JavaScript contacts the server. All right, so in a normal form submission, I would give it a name so that it can appear on the query parameters. And because I'm trying to follow the rules of XML, if I want it to be initially turned on, then I need to use the checked attribute, but I have to supply a value for that attribute. Okay, and so it might look something like this. And this is a little bit of a joke because the expected behavior in real life is that users should actively opt into your mailing list, and you shouldn't send them junk mail, spam mail, marketing mail unless they ask for it. And you should not have it turned on by default. You'd have it turned off by default. It'll annoy your users otherwise. Next, radio buttons. So radio buttons, input type equals radio, have the same general goal as checkboxes. Let the user choose something among a preset list of choices. However, the difference is that with checkboxes, you can check as many as you want. But with radio buttons, if I click on MasterCard, the previous entry will pop out. And if I then click on Discover, MasterCard will pop out. And so the point is that checkboxes let you check 0 or more among a list of choices, whereas radio buttons let you select exactly one among a list of choices. And so how does the browser know if you have more than one group of radio buttons in the page, which ought to go together? In other words, which are mutually exclusive? And the answer is by the name. So most of the time we said, well, the name is not necessarily so important if we're contacting the server via JavaScript, because JavaScript can more easily find the element with ID than with name. And so it's quite common with JavaScript to look up the element by ID, read its value, and kind of in our code produce a query parameter that we send to the server that's not necessarily the name. But in case of radio buttons, you got to have a name, because all radio buttons in a form that share the same name will automatically not be visually grouped together, but will be grouped together in the sense that only one in the group can be selected at a time, and when you change the selection, the other one pops out. So it's important, if you have two different sets of radio buttons and you want them to operate independently, you have to give them different names. All right, so here's an example. I gave a set of radio buttons the same name. That's the example that we see in the upper right here. And that's the reason why when I select American Express, Java Smart Card pops out automatically. If they were checkboxes or they were radio buttons that had different names, that wouldn't happen. Checkboxes let you select multiple values among a list of choices. Radio buttons let you select a single value from a list of choices. Well, select boxes, drop-down menus, also let you select either a single or multiple entries from a list of choices. So they have the same general goal, but they have a different format. Select boxes, and the default behavior is you can only select one, they're more compact. The user initially only sees one line, and it doesn't kind of pop into the menu until the user clicks on it. Whereas with radio buttons, which also let you select one from a list of choices, all of them are displayed at once initially. So it really depends whether you want to make it more compact and only show one value, and the user doesn't even know what the other choices are until the user clicks on the list box, or you want to show them all at once. But radio buttons and single selection select boxes serve the same general purpose, selecting one from a list of choices. Okay, so select gives the name, and option gives you the value choices. So you might have something like this. You have select around the outside with a name that in a normal form submission will be sent to the server, maybe with JavaScript and ID, but absolutely you need options inside that have individual values. The text between the start and the end tag is what gets displayed to the user, but it's the value attribute that becomes actually part of the form submission, or if you look up the value of the element via JavaScript, that's the value that you look up. So you need to have both. The value attribute is the server value. The text between start option and end option is what's displayed to the end user. And so initially, they might just see that, but the little triangle gives visual feedback telling the user, hey, this is something you can click on. And when they click on it, then they see a drop-down menu. Okay, if you want to make them multi-select list boxes, which correspond very much to checkboxes, then if you give size, like say you say size equals 4, then 4 entries are shown initially, whereas with normal select boxes, only 1 entry is shown initially. And if you specify multiple, then multiple selections are allowed, just like with checkboxes. So if I give this size equals 6, and there are exactly 6 options over here, then there won't be any scroll bars. It'll just show a list box showing all of the entries. That's very similar to having 6 checkboxes on top of each other. And because I said multiple, notice that for multiple, I supplied an attribute value, so I conformed with the rules of XML, even though browsers don't require you to do this. And so this result is very similar to having 6 checkboxes on top of each other, and they serve a very similar purpose. Let the user select 0 or more entries among a set of fixed choices.